my professor back in the mid 60s, I took this famous year-long course with Moore, wrote a book called Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, in which he explored the deep historical conditions and structural factors that are conducive or not conducive to the rather rare event of having a liberal democracy. After World War II, we kind of had a proliferation of countries that call themselves democracies, especially after the fall of the wall in 1990, with the exception, notable exception of China. By 1996, you were up to 81 countries out of the 195 on the UN roster. But we've seen a lot of recent slippage. And so one of the things we want to worry about is whether these, the setbacks we've been saying lately are fundamental or whether they're reversible. To what extent are they the result of endogenous factors, internal factors like those that Barrington Moore emphasized, or whether they're actually due to outside intervention and more transnational factors. We've seen no shortage of interventions by the United States itself abroad when it comes to intervening in democracies. And so there's a long list of countries that people of my generation especially remember as having been, very important pieces of evidence here in this kind of track record. Chile, 1973, I had friends who were jailed there. Argentina, 1976, another overthrow. Beijing, 1989. I was actually ended up being in Tiananmen Square for the month before the Chinese military moved in. Russia, 1986, and then 96. During that whole period of transition, I was visiting Russia. And Haiti and much of Latin America. I've been to a lot of these places where the United States ended up being on the negative side of the story. So it's with some sober kind of reflection that we come to this topic now that the problem has kind of come back to haunt us with accusations about Russia intervening here in our elections, just like we did in the Russian election in 1996. The old style interventions had kind of big power traditions, used a variety of tactics to overthrow democratically elected governments or to assist the repression of opposition. And I won't go through this litany of lists, but there's kind of a long list of unsavory behaviors. You can study these cases in more detail. The most recent experience I had was in Haiti in 2011 when Hillary Clinton basically just informed the then president of Haiti that the candidate he was backing to be president, was not going to be on the U.S. list and wouldn't receive any aid. And so that was one model of our actually overriding local preferences here. But what I'm seeing here in terms of the overall trends for democratic regimes is some real concern that we're facing, kind of a downturn in the popularity of democratic regimes around the planet. There's a number of different organizations that scored countries on the basis of their so-called freedom or their democratic rights, and this is just one example. Most of the data points in the same direction, which is for at least the last decade. So-called democratic regimes have been under threat. And the number of so-called free regimes has been declining. I think the key challenges that we face now on the margin that we've been aware of here are at least these three, and then we can talk about others. I'm not going to go into them in much detail. My guests on the panel will begin to do that. But one of the things we're talking about here today is the trend towards seeing voter information and news being manipulated, either by way of the erosion of individual digital privacy, in which people are profiled, and firms like Cambridge Analytica have been able to predict how voter segments would behave. And then that's really nothing new. What's new is to use that to target specific voters using platforms like Facebook with specific kinds of tailored news, so that effectively you tribalize the voter population into rival segments. Francis Kagero will go into the experience that Kenya had at the hands of Cambridge Analytica in some detail and talk about the dire consequences of that kind of polarization. But that's an effect that we've seen in many countries, not only in Africa, but also in the UK, in the Brazil election that brought Bolsonaro to power. And side by side with that is the increasing capability of being able to manipulate news and generate so-called fake news propagation. At the same time, you've seen independent journalism under threat economically. The quality and the trust of the public in journalism has declined. So there's this overall kind of problem for democratic values that has assumed that voters would know what they were doing, or at least be informed or capable of being informed when they went into the polling booths, is a sort of a fundamental pillar of democracy that's under attack. A second, basically, sort of structural feature here is the role of unlimited campaign finance and lobbying expenditures, not only around the time of campaigns, but well beyond. The role of the revolving door in many government offices. And so that you have very unequal access to the halls of power. At the same time, a lot of the people in who have the access have been avoiding taxes like crazy and manipulating the tax laws, as we've talked about in this course, with or without the help of the global haven industry. So there's a sort of representation, over-representation without taxation for this elite. And so that's a very specific problem that we have to deal with. Finally, I'd mention the role of alternative models that are being proposed by some countries, notably China, a form of authoritarian capitalism that from a slight distance may appear to some to be more competent. Certainly, the track record with respect to the COVID crisis of places like Singapore and China have been sort of much stronger than that of Western countries. And there's been a kind of interesting dialogue back and forth about to what extent we really can defend democratic values given this track. The thought for the day is that we have a lot of issues to deal with at home and abroad with respect to democracy and where we stand. So I'll just give you the floor and let you take off with that.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. It's a pleasure to be back with you and the seminar. I enjoyed it last time. Democracy, it's a big topic. And I'm not going to make a long presentation, but I am going to talk about a little of the history of democracy and a little bit of the problems of democracy in the United States, and potentially some antidotes to those problems. The history of the United States as a democracy is the history of the vote. Because when the country was founded, the only people who could vote were white men with property. And that changed in the 1830s when white men without property were given the right to vote. And then it changed in the 1860s when African American men were given the right to vote, even though in fact they weren't allowed to vote in many parts of the country. And then women were given the right to vote, not until 1919. So for literally almost 150 years, women had no vote at all in America. And then in the 1950s, young people were given the right to vote, meaning people between 18 and 21. Before then, it was 21. And so the history of America is the history of the vote. Who got it and how did they use it? For example, in the 1830s, when white men without property were given the right to vote, that led to the election of Andrew Jackson, who was a genuine populist and who was responding to those white men without property. I think that, after the Civil War, for a brief period of time, about 10 years, Reconstruction, African Americans participated openly and fully throughout the United States. And there were African American Congress people, even I think a senator, and plenty of local officials. That closed in 1876 when, as a result of the election between the Democrat Samuel Tilden and the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, there was an agreement that was achieved that in exchange for the southern states giving the Republican Hayes their electoral votes, Hayes agreed to remove the federal troops from the South. And as soon as the troops were removed, Jim Crow was established in the South, and African Americans were once again denied the right to vote. Now, I look at this history of the vote, and I believe that it is really dependent on, we get what we elect. I mean, just thinking 2016, over 100 million Americans who could have voted did not vote, and we got Donald Trump. In 2020, more Americans voted than ever in our history, and we got Joe Biden. Still, there were millions who chose not to vote. So I look at this and I say, the problem of democracy, and this is debatable, is not the separation of powers between the executive and judicial and legislative branches of government. It is not the Constitution. It is certainly not the Declaration of Independence. It is instead the way we have conducted our elections and who has participated in those elections. So if I were looking out at the world today, I would see the problems of democracy in the United States being several-fold. One of them is there's way too much money in politics. The Koch brothers and their assorted billionaires have taken over the Republican Party and segments of the Democratic Party. Now, how is that possible? That was possible because of a Supreme Court decision in 2013. The decision in 2013 was to essentially say that money, that was 2012, money was speech, and that you could not limit money because you'd be limiting speech. And the First Amendment to the Constitution, which is the right to free speech, guarantees you the right to free speech. As a result of that Supreme Court ruling, the oligarchs took over in a fundamental way. And they've spent billions of dollars consolidating their power. The Koch brothers, for example, have established, at one point, there were more people employed by the Kochs than the National Republican Party. And they had taken control of state legislatures through vacations in which the legislator would have a free weekend in the Bahamas, and he would then be given a notebook at the end with sample laws that he could pass that would serve the interests of those who were sponsoring it, largely in this case, energy interests. The reality is that money has distorted the democratic process to a frightening degree. It also has led to the concentration of financial power as opposed to simply business power. I look at that and I say that that is a reality that flows from a Supreme Court decision that wrongly stated that you cannot limit money, because to limit money, you're limiting free speech. Now, there are ways around that, and I'll come back to that. But the second problem with democracy is, again, wide segments of the population not voting. And that, again, can be seen through a Supreme Court decision. In 2013, the first dealing with money was 2010. And in 2013, the Supreme Court invalidated Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Now, back up a little bit. Again, into the Civil War, Reconstruction, the deal with Hayes, Jim Crow arrives, African Americans are denied the right to vote. When Lyndon Johnson was president, he passed the law, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And when he passed that law, he said to some of his staff, well, we just lost the South, because the South knew what that meant. And that was that African Americans will now vote, and they will play a very big role in elections in the South. And so the Supreme Court, then fundamental to that law was Section 5, which said any change in state or local voting laws in 12 states, 8 southern states, 4 northern states who had a history of racial discrimination, must be approved by the federal Justice Department. From 1965 until 2013, there were over 1,000 laws that were stopped from going into effect by the Justice Department invalidating state and local laws. The result was the emergence of a very vibrant African-American political culture, and the much more reflective of the states in which people voted. 2013, Supreme Court invalidated Section 5 of the voting rights legislation. It invalidated it because it said, we don't have discrimination anymore. This was outdated. So they repealed Section 5, and literally 2 days after it was repealed, Texas and North Carolina sponsored very restrictive voting laws. And that has only accelerated since 2013. And yet, African Americans really found a way to organize and to cast their ballots. And that's really what elected Joe Biden and what elected a Democratic Senate in 2020. So but remember, the history of America is the history of the vote. The Republican Party in states that they control have passed laws since November that overtly suppress African American, Latino, and even Asian votes. And they become so outrageous that one of the laws passed in Georgia in the last 2 months is that if you're standing in line to vote and someone gives you a bottle of water, that person has violated a law and will be prosecuted. But it also deals with cutting back on absentee voting, on early voting, on so-called drop boxes where people go and put their vote in before the election. And what we are experiencing now is a decision by the Republican Party that it cannot win in an emerging America that is more brown, black, Asian, and therefore it must suppress the vote of brown, black, and Asian voters. And that is explicitly what they're trying to do. Of course, these will be tested and they will go to the Supreme Court. And some of them will be invalidated. How many, I don't know. Given the nature of this Supreme Court that is controlled by Republicans, we don't know if they're going to be even-handed or partisan. But the problem of our democracy boils down to money and to voter suppression. And there is a way out of all this. I mean, it's easy to say what should be done. Basically, public financing of all elections. That no private money, or no private money above $100 or $250. And certainly limiting the role of billionaires in the legislative process. And on voter suppression, the law, you have to appeal to the courts. In the absence of the courts, you have to find new ways to organize. So in America, we still have a reasonable structure in terms of the Declaration, voting rights, the separation of powers, but we do not have, at this stage, a country as democratic as it was even 10 years ago.
Wow, that's challenging and thought-provoking. I could ask a bunch of questions, but please, everyone else join in. Students. Harrison.
Hi, Senator Bradley. Thank you so much for talking to us again today. Enzo and I wrote a paper for this this particular class, also proposing public financing of elections, and we were trying to think through how that might work. You know, whether you would equally distribute some pot of money to political parties or whatever else. Aside perhaps from the feasibility of it, what do you think is like the best theoretical approach to financing elections?
I think that the best way is having limits on what any one person can contribute that are hard limits. And I would have an option for public financing. And the way that would work is if you got 10,000 signatures, you would qualify for public financing. And it would be, and you can do it one of two ways. You can either do it totally public money, or you can do it for every dollar that you raise, the public will put in $3, which is a form of public financing. If the dollar is raised in low amounts. So I see matching funds or fully funded public financing as the way to go.
Great. Enzo, over to you.
Hi, Senator Bradley. Thank you so much for your time today. So my question is also about money in politics and just democracy. And you said that, you know, it's a big problem, which I totally agree with. But then it leads me to my question which is whether money in politics is something new. Now, I believe that democracy is doing what it was originally intended to do based on the American version of it, which is what we have today all across the world. Democracy was brought to the US because of the interest of the landed and property owning elite at the time. They had money, and money was the source of their influence and the votes they got originally. Now, maybe that changed over time, but it seems to me as though the billionaires of today, even though they're not the original American revolutionaries, they have the same sort of influence in society. So please go ahead.
Yeah. Yes, I would say that there are phases. From the founding of the country until the early 20th century, it was totally free for all. There were no limits for anything. And then from roughly 1915 until 1974, there were no spending limits. And it was a little more controlled, but no spending limits. Then in the 1970s, Watergate occurred. And that was Richard Nixon and his henchmen walking around with satchels full of dollar bills, right? And that so offended the public that campaign finance laws were established that limited what could be spent on a political campaign. And it limited what I could spend on a political campaign and on my own campaign. And within 2 years, a case had reached the Supreme Court where the Supreme Court said, I can limit the amount of money spent and contributed, but I can't limit the amount of money that I spend on my own campaign. And still there were limits. And the limits continued until the Supreme Court ruling that removed any effort to have campaign finance reform, public financing, because it says you cannot limit the amount of money, because to do so, you are limiting somebody's right to free speech. And so, yeah, money's always been a problem in politics. But now, with the Supreme Court's stamp of approval, it's become an industry. And I could name any number of books that you should read. Dark Money is one of them, by Jane Mayer. Another one is, let me see, I got it right here. Oh yeah, is Shadow Network by Ann Nelson. Another is by Anne McLean. It's called Democracy Crumbling, I think it is. Those are 3 books that will detail for you the role of money in politics. And I think Shadow Network is interesting because the author takes a group of dedicated conservatives, right-wing conservatives, who took over the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the organization that runs Baptist churches. took it over, made it more conservative, used the same techniques, took over the Republican Party. And the role that Koch and other people played in that. Those are three must-reads for you. If you want to understand money in politics.
Dominic has a question from Johannesburg. Are you in Johannesburg or Cape Town?
Cape Town. Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Senator Bradley. A quick question.
Introduce yourself briefly, Dominic, because I just want people to know who you are. So,
Sorry. I'm an activist from South Africa, and I work at a think tank where I do a combination of research around political economy and trainings with various stakeholders on that research. So, Senator Bradley, I think it's important to speak about the idea of public funding, and I think it's useful. My question, however, is related to the shadow network, the role of Koch and its big conglomerates in campaigning and party funding. Of course, there's a difference in the South African context and the US context. But one principle is that we don't know who's actually financing different electoral parties. And often there's a bit of financing of different parties by the same groups. So isn't that an important principle in addition to public financing and the call for that? For every dollar that a party gets, it must be publicly disclosed and accounted for.
Well,
Thanks.
I agree with you that transparency is the first step, but that is not the final step. If you want to eliminate money in politics, given what the Supreme Court has ruled, you need to have a constitutional amendment that says federal, state, and local governments may limit the amount of money spent in a political campaign. If you had that, you could then begin to enact campaign finance reforms. Absent that, whatever law you pass will simply be appealed to the court, and the court will not sustain it. But transparency is an important first step. Some Republicans say that's all you need. You just need to reveal who contributed. But then what they do is defund the Federal Election Commission, so there's no way to enforce the law.
wow. Follow on, Dominic?
I agree in orientation that it's the first step and an important first step, but that it needs to be extended beyond that. So I agree and happy with that. I just thought it was a missing element in the initial contribution, but thank you, Senator.
Great question. Thank you. Radion.
Yeah, Senator, thank you for speaking with us today. And my question is along the same lines as Dominic's. After the Citizens United and the Buckley decisions, I mean, some justices on the court raised the concern that, campaign finance regulations might limit the ACLU, for example, or the NRA from promoting, certain politicians that might, promote their own interests. And the court kind of found that concerning. And years later, Justin Levitt from the Yale Law School proposed something along of a nutrition facts label on political speech that would reveal who contributed to certain speech while not restricting it. Do you think that's a viable source of kind of limiting the power of money in politics? And what do you make of the concerns of the justices that, some politically minded organizations might be limited in their speech for elections?
I'm not sure I quite understand what the professor would like to do based on what you said.
Well,
I think I take it as transparency, and the more transparency, the better. I don't think that you're going to limit the ACLU by making it illegal to contribute to political campaigns. I mean, the ACLU will advocate for positions. The NRA will advocate for positions. It is not the advocacy of positions. It is the connecting of that advocacy to a particular candidate running and therefore supporting that candidate overtly. I mean, there's no reason that an advocacy group can't advocate whatever they want on gun control or whatever. And then, but they can't send mailers around to people. Or the NRA once ran an ad in the 1980s in Wisconsin. And the ad, TV ad, was an elderly lady who's sitting in a rocking chair. And she's alone in a small house. And she hears somebody at the door. And she looks, she's frightened. And then the announcer says, if she had a gun, she wouldn't have to be frightened, right? Now, that's the kind of thing, and vote for candidate Y. You can talk all you want about the issue, but don't connect it to vote for candidate Y.
Thank you so much